I should have known something was wrong when Thunder started acting strange around the barn. For 3 years, that old Appaloosa had trotted into that weathered wooden structure every evening without hesitation, eager for his oats and the comfort of his stall. But last Tuesday, everything changed. I was leading him back from the pasture as usual, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across our small farm. Thunder walked beside me willingly until we reached the barn's entrance. Then he stopped dead, his ears pinned back, nostrils flaring wide as he took in whatever scent had spooked him. "Come on, boy," I coaxed, giving his lead rope a gentle tug. But Thunder planted his hooves firmly in the dirt, his massive frame trembling. His eyes rolled white, showing more fear than I'd ever seen from him, even during last summer's thunderstorms that had sent him into a panic. I tried everything: carrots, sweet talk, even pushing from behind. Nothing worked. Thunder would rather stand in the rain than step one hoof inside that barn. At first, I chalked it up to some animal that had wandered in, maybe a raccoon or possum that had spooked him. Horses could be silly about the strangest things. But as I stood there in the fading light, watching my normally calm horse shake with terror, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. There was something different about the air around the barn, something that made even my human senses feel uneasy. I decided to leave Thunder in the pasture that night, figuring whatever had scared him would be gone by morning. How wrong I was. The next morning brought no relief. If anything, Thunder's fear had intensified overnight. I found him pressed against the far fence, as far from the barn as the pasture would allow. His feed bucket sat untouched, unusual for a horse who typically greeted dawn with an eager whinny for breakfast. I approached the barn alone, trying to identify what could be causing such distress. The structure looked the same as always. Weathered red paint peeling in places, the heavy wooden doors slightly ajar as I'd left them. The familiar sense of hay and leather tack greeted me as I stepped inside. Everything appeared normal. Thunder's stall was clean, his water bucket full. The feed bins were secure, no signs of raccoons or other intruders. Sunlight streamed through the gaps between boards, illuminating dancing dust motes in the still air. Yet something felt off, though I couldn't pinpoint what. I spent 20 minutes searching every corner, checking the hayloft, examining the tack room. Nothing seemed out of place. The rational part of my mind insisted I was being foolish, letting my horse's skittishness affect my own judgment. But when I tried to lead Thunder to the barn entrance again, his reaction was even more violent. He reared up, nearly pulling the rope from my hands, his eyes wild with primal terror. The sound he made wasn't a typical horse noise, it was almost human in its desperation. "Easy, Thunder, easy," I whispered, but my own voice betrayed my growing anxiety. That afternoon, I called Dr. Martinez, our veterinarian. Maybe Thunder was sick, maybe there was a medical explanation for his behavior. But even as I dialed her number, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something beyond veterinary medicine. Something was very wrong with my barn. Dr. Martinez arrived the next morning, her truck kicking up dust as she pulled into our driveway. Maria had been treating our animals for over a decade, and I trusted her judgment implicitly. If anyone could explain Thunder's strange behavior, it would be her. "Let's see what's going on with our boy," she said, pulling on latex gloves as Thunder watched nervously from across the pasture. The examination was thorough. Temperature, pulse, reflexes, everything checked out normal. Thunder stood calmly for Dr. Martinez, showing none of the agitation he displayed around the barn. His eyes were clear, his coat healthy, his appetite apparently fine once I'd moved his feed to the pasture. "Physically, he's perfect, Doctor," Martinez concluded, patting Thunder's neck. "Sometimes horses develop phobias about specific places or objects. Could be anything: a bad memory, a smell we can't detect, even electromagnetic fields from old wiring." She suggested gradually reintroducing thunder to the barn, starting with just approaching the entrance and rewarding calm behavior. Horses are prey animals, she reminded me. Their survival depends on detecting danger we might miss. Sometimes we have to trust their instincts. Didi, her words stayed with me long after she'd driven away. Trust their instincts. What if Thunder was picking up on something I couldn't sense? What if his terror wasn't irrational but a warning? That evening, I decided to spend more time in the barn myself, hoping to identify whatever was spooking him. I pulled up an old chair and sat quietly in the center aisle, letting my senses adjust to the environment. The barn felt different after dark. Shadows seemed deeper, sounds more amplified. The wind through the loose boards created an almost musical whistle, and somewhere in the structure, wood creaked rhythmically like footsteps. By the time I left that night, I was beginning to understand Thunder's reluctance. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the old farmhouse seemed amplified. Every gust of wind against the windows made me start. I found myself straining to hear sounds from the direction of the barn, though I wasn't sure what I was listening for. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and made myself coffee. From the kitchen window, I could see the barn's silhouette against the star-filled sky. It looked innocent enough in the moonlight, just an old agricultural building weathered by decades of prairie winds and storms. But as I watched, something caught my eye. A faint light seemed to flicker in one of the upper windows, just for a moment, like a firefly or reflection. I blinked, focusing harder, but saw nothing more. Probably just moonlight hitting a piece of old glass at the right angle. The next morning, I found Thunder pressed against the fence again, but this time something was different. He wasn't just avoiding the barn, he was watching it. His ears were pricked forward, alert and focused on something I couldn't see. I followed his gaze to the hayloft window where I thought I'd seen the light. Nothing unusual was visible from ground level, but the window seemed darker somehow, as if something was blocking the light from inside. Grabbing a ladder from the tool shed, I decided to investigate the loft properly. I'd been up there countless times over the years, storing hay and checking for roof leaks, but I hadn't climbed those wooden rungs in months. The ladder felt solid enough as I ascended, though each step seemed to echo more loudly than usual. The barn below grew smaller as I climbed toward whatever was waiting in the shadows above. What I found in that loft would haunt me for the rest of my life. The smell hit me first, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. It wasn't the typical scent of old hay and dust I expected from the loft. This was something organic, something wrong. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the small windows, I saw them hanging from the rafters like grotesque fruit. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. The shapes were too regular to be natural, too deliberate to be coincidental. Dozens of small cloth bundles hung from lengths of twine, each one carefully knotted and positioned. They swayed gently in the air currents, creating an almost hypnotic dance of shadows on the wooden walls. Some were made from faded fabric, others from what looked like burlap or canvas. My hands shook as I approached the nearest bundle. Up close, I could see that each one was sewn shut with meticulous care, the stitching forming strange patterns I didn't recognize. The sweet smell was stronger here, almost overwhelming. One bundle hung lower than the others, within reach. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I touched it gently. It was soft, yielding and warm, as if something alive moved within the fabric. I jerked my hand back, nearly losing my balance on the loft floor. The bundle continued to sway, and in that motion I thought I saw others beginning to move as well, as if my presence had disturbed some delicate equilibrium. Thunder's terrified whinnying from the pasture broke through my paralysis. He had somehow sensed what I was discovering, had been trying to warn me all along. These things, whatever they were, had been hanging above his stall for who knows how long. I backed toward the ladder, unable to look away from the swaying forms. There had to be 50 of them, maybe more, arranged in careful rows like some macabre harvest. As I descended, one thought kept echoing in my mind. I had to find out what was inside those bundles. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, knowing what hung in the darkness above Thunder's stall? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those cloth bundles swaying in the shadows, felt that unnatural warmth beneath my fingertips. By dawn, I'd made a decision. I had to know what was inside them, but I couldn't bring myself to cut one open alone. My neighbor Jake had helped me with farm repairs before. Solid, practical, not easily spooked. If anyone would believe what I'd found, it would be him. Jake arrived around 8, coffee mug in hand, and skepticism written across his weathered face. "You're telling me your horse won't go in the barn because of some old rags hanging in the loft?" "They're not just rags, Jake. There's something inside them. Something that doesn't feel right." He followed me to the barn reluctantly, probably humoring what he saw as a case of rural cabin fever. But when we climbed into the loft together, Jake's casual demeanor evaporated instantly. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, staring at the hanging bundles. "How long have these been here?" "I don't know. I rarely come up to this part of the loft. Could be months, could be years." Jake approached one of the bundles with the same horrified fascination I'd felt. "They're arranged in some kind of pattern," he observed. "Look at how they're positioned. It's deliberate." He was right. What I'd initially seen as random placement was actually carefully organized. The bundles formed concentric circles, with the largest ones at the center and smaller ones radiating outward. It looked almost ritualistic. "We need to open one," Jake said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. I'd brought my grandfather's old hunting knife, its blade sharp enough to cut through the thick stitching. Jake held his phone's flashlight while I approached the lowest hanging bundle. The first cut released a fresh wave of that sweet, nauseating smell. Whatever was inside had been preserved somehow, kept from decay by methods I didn't want to contemplate. The fabric parted easily under the knife's edge, revealing what lay within. Jake's flashlight beam illuminated the contents, and we both stepped back instinctively, our minds struggling to process what we were seeing. Inside the bundle were bones. Small, delicate bones arranged with the same meticulous care as the bundles themselves. But these weren't human bones. They were too small, too fragile. Bird bones, I realized, from what looked like several different species. But the bones weren't clean. Strips of tissue still clung to them, preserved in some kind of waxy substance that gleamed in Jake's flashlight. The sweet smell was coming from this preservation material, whatever it was. "What the hell is this?" Jake breathed, his voice barely audible. I was examining the bones more closely when I noticed something else. They were arranged in a specific pattern, wings spread, legs positioned as if the bird were in flight. Someone had taken great care to maintain the creature's natural form even in death. "Look at this," I said, pointing to thin wires that ran through the bones. "Someone wired these together. This isn't just preservation, it's reconstruction." Jake opened another bundle, while I continued examining the first. This one contained what appeared to be a small mammal, a squirrel or rabbit, similarly preserved and wired into a lifelike pose. The craftsmanship was incredible and deeply disturbing. "There's something else," Jake said, his voice tight with tension. He was holding a piece of paper that had been tucked inside the second bundle. The writing was spidery, old-fashioned, but legible. "For the protection of this dwelling and all who shelter within." We opened 3 more bundles, finding similar contents each time. Different animals, all small, all preserved with that same waxy substance and arranged in natural poses. Each bundle contained a similar note with variations on the same theme: protection, warding, keeping evil at bay. "Someone's been making these for years," I said, looking at the sheer number of bundles hanging around us. "This is someone's life work." But whose work? And why in my barn? Jake and I didn't open any more bundles that day. We'd seen enough to know we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. Instead, I decided to research the history of my property, hoping to find clues about who might have created this macabre collection. At the county courthouse, I traced the deed back through several owners. My property had been in the Whitmore family for nearly 80 years before I'd purchased it 5 years ago. The previous owner, Eleanor Whitmore, had been in her 90s when she sold to me, a frail woman who'd barely spoken during our single meeting. Old Eleanor was eccentric, the clerk told me when I asked about her. Lost her husband in Vietnam, never remarried, lived alone out there for decades. People said she was a bit odd, but harmless enough. I remembered Eleanor vaguely from our transaction. She'd insisted on walking through the barn one final time before signing the papers, running her gnarled hands along the wooden walls like she was saying goodbye to an old friend. "She ever mention anything about the barn specifically?" I asked. The clerk thought for a moment. "Come to think of it, she did ask the strangest thing. Wanted to know if you'd be keeping animals in there. When you said yes, she seemed relieved, I guess. Said something about the barn needing to stay alive." That phrase sent chills down my spine. The barn needing to stay alive. What had Eleanor known about those bundles? Had she been the one creating them all these years? I drove home with more questions than answers, but at least I had a name to work with. Eleanor Whitmore had lived on my property for most of her adult life. If anyone knew the secret of those hanging bundles, it would be her. The problem was, Eleanor had died 3 months after selling me the property. Whatever secrets she'd kept were buried with her, or so I thought. Cleaning out the old farmhouse when I'd first moved in, I'd found several boxes of items Eleanor had left behind. I'd stored them in my basement, meaning to go through them eventually, but never finding the time. Now desperate for answers, I retrieved those boxes and began searching through their contents. Most of it was typical elderly person detritus: old photographs, recipes clipped from magazines, church bulletins from decades past. But in the bottom of the third box, wrapped in a faded towel, I found Eleanor's journal. The leather cover was worn smooth by decades of handling, and the pages were yellowed with age. The earliest entries dated back to 1963, just after her husband's death. The handwriting was the same spidery script I'd seen on the notes in the bundles. At first, the entries were mundane: weather observations, grocery lists, notes about farm maintenance. But as I read deeper, a disturbing pattern emerged. March 15th, 1963. "Something's wrong with the barn. The animals won't go near it. Found strange marks carved into the support beams, symbols I don't recognize. Harold never mentioned anything like this." March 22nd, 1963. "The nightmares are getting worse. I keep dreaming about things moving in the loft, scratching sounds in the walls. Maybe I should sell this place." April 3rd, 1963. "Mrs. Kowalski from town brought me some old books. Says her grandmother dealt with similar problems on their farm in Poland. The symbols in the barn match ones in these books. They're not random, they're some kind of invitation." April 10th, 1963. Tried the first protection bundle today. Used a sparrow that died naturally, preserved it the way Mrs. Kowalski's book described, hung it in the exact center of the loft. The scratching sounds stopped. My hands were shaking as I read. Eleanor hadn't been creating those bundles out of madness or obsession. According to her journal, she'd been fighting something, protecting the barn and anyone who lived there, but protecting us from what? Eleanor's journal entries became more detailed as I read on, documenting a decades-long battle against something she never quite named directly. She referred to it only as the presence, or what wants in. May 1963, the single bundle isn't enough. The presence is stronger than I thought. Added 3 more, Robin, Mouse and Bat. The positioning matters. They have to form a barrier, each one reinforcing the others. September 1963, nearly lost the barn last night. Something got through my defenses, started tearing at the bundles. Found half of them on the floor this morning, torn open, contents scattered. Had to start over with fresh specimens. December 1963, understanding more now. The presence feeds on fear, on death, on suffering. The preserved animals confuse it. Death made permanent, unchanging. It can't process what doesn't decay, what doesn't feed its hunger. The journal detailed Eleanor's gradual expansion of her protection system. What had started with a single bundle grew into the complex arrangement Jake and I had discovered. Each animal had been chosen for specific properties: birds for their connection to air and spirit, small mammals for their earthbound nature, reptiles and amphibians for their connection to water. 1975. 27 years I've been doing this. The system works, but it requires constant maintenance. Some bundles last years, others need replacing within months. The presence tests them constantly, probing for weakness. 1983. Tried to explain this to Dr. Peterson when he suggested I move to town. How can I make him understand? This isn't just my problem anymore. It's attached to the land, to the barn. If I leave, if the protections fail, it will find someone else to torment. As I read, I began to understand the true scope of what Eleanor had been dealing with. This wasn't just about my property. She believed something malevolent was trying to break through from somewhere else, using the barn as an entry point. 1998. Getting too old for this. Arthritis makes climbing to the loft painful. But I can't stop, won't stop. Have to find someone to take over when I'm gone. The final entries were the most chilling of all. Eleanor's final journal entries painted a picture of a woman desperate to find someone who could continue her work. She'd spent years looking for the right person, someone who would live on the property, keep animals in the barn, and most importantly, maintain the protection bundles. 2019. The young man who's interested in buying the property seems perfect. Has a horse, understands the land. When I mentioned the barn needing to stay alive with animals, he didn't question it. Maybe he'll understand when the time comes. 2020. Sold the property today. Tried to tell him about the bundles, but how do you explain 70 years of fighting something that shouldn't exist? Left the journal where he might find it eventually. Hope it won't be too late. The final entry was dated just days before Eleanor's death. The protections are failing. Can feel the presence pushing harder against the barriers. New owner doesn't know what he's inherited. God forgive me for leaving him unprepared. But what choice did I have? Maybe Thunder will sense the danger, guide him to the truth. Animals always know. I set the journal down with trembling hands. Eleanor had passed her burden to me without my knowledge or consent. Those bundles in the loft weren't just the quirky remnants of an eccentric old woman. They were the only thing standing between my property and something far worse. Thunder had sensed it immediately. His fear wasn't of the bundles themselves, but of what would happen if they failed. He'd been trying to warn me, to keep me away from the barn until I was ready to understand. But understanding brought its own terror. According to Eleanor's journal, the presence had been growing stronger over the years. The protections that had worked for decades were beginning to weaken. Some of the bundles I'd seen were probably decades old, their power diminished. If I didn't act soon, if I didn't take up Eleanor's work, something would break through, and I had no idea what form that breakthrough might take. As if in response to my thoughts, a sound drifted from the direction of the barn, a low scratching like claws on wood. The scratching sounds continued through the night, growing louder and more insistent. By morning, I'd made my decision. I couldn't pretend this wasn't happening, couldn't convince myself that Eleanor's journal was the product of a deluded mind. Thunder's behavior, the bundles, the growing sense of wrongness around the barn, it all fit together too perfectly. I spent the day studying Eleanor's journal more carefully, paying attention to her methods and materials. The preservation process involved a mixture of beeswax, herbs, and other substances I'd have to acquire. The positioning of the bundles followed specific patterns based on cardinal directions and lunar phases. Most importantly, Eleanor emphasized that the animals had to die naturally. Using killed specimens would corrupt the protection, potentially making things worse. I would have to wait for roadkill, natural deaths, animals that died of old age or illness. Jake returned that afternoon, bringing coffee and skepticism in equal measure. "You can't seriously believe all this," he said, after I'd shown him the relevant journal passages. "Then explain Thunder's behavior, explain the scratching sounds, explain why those bundles are arranged in perfect geometric patterns." Jake didn't have answers, but he agreed to help me start replacing the oldest bundles. We found a hawk that had died after hitting a power line, and I followed Eleanor's preservation process as closely as possible. The mixture of beeswax and herbs created the same sweet smell I'd noticed in the loft, and the preservation seemed to work exactly as described. Climbing back into the loft felt like entering a sacred space. The original bundles hung around us like silent guardians, and I could feel the weight of Eleanor's decades-long vigil. As I hung the new bundle in place of a deteriorated one, the scratching sounds from the walls seemed to diminish slightly. "It's working," Jake admitted reluctantly. "Whatever this is, it's actually working." Over the following weeks, I gradually replaced the most deteriorated bundles, learning Eleanor's techniques through trial and error. Thunder began approaching the barn again, though he remained wary. The scratching sounds became less frequent. But I could feel the presence Eleanor had written about, pressing against the barriers, testing for weakness. This was a temporary solution at best. 6 months have passed since I discovered Eleanor's secret, and I've settled into the rhythm of maintenance she described in her journal. The bundle system requires constant attention, checking for deterioration, replacing specimens that have lost their potency, adjusting positions based on seasonal changes. I've expanded my knowledge beyond Eleanor's notes, researching similar practices in folklore and anthropology. What she was doing has roots in cultures around the world. The use of preserved animals for protection, the creation of barriers against malevolent forces. She wasn't crazy. She was continuing a tradition older than written history. Thunder now enters the barn willingly, though he still shows respect for the loft space. He seems to understand that he's under protection, that the strange bundles hanging above his stall are keeping him safe from something far worse than a few preserved animals. The presence is still there. I can feel it during the darkest hours of night, pressing against Eleanor's carefully constructed defenses. Sometimes I hear the faint scratching sounds, reminding me that my vigil can never end. But the system holds, as it has for 70 years. I've begun keeping my own journal, documenting changes in the bundle's effectiveness, noting which preservation methods work best for different animals. Someday, I'll need to find someone to take over this responsibility, just as Eleanor found me. It's a strange life, maintaining a barrier between worlds that most people don't even know exist. But it's necessary work, and I've come to find peace in it. The barn stands secure, protected by dozens of small guardians hanging in the shadows above. Thunder grazes peacefully in his pasture now, no longer afraid to come home each evening. He knows, as Eleanor knew, as I now know, that some burdens are worth carrying. The watch continues. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it gave you chills and made you think twice about what might be lurking in the shadows of your own property? Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I love hearing from people all around the world who share a passion for mysterious and unsettling tales. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel for more first-person horror narratives. There are so many dark secrets hidden in rural communities, so many stories that need to be told. Until next time, keep your eyes open and trust your instincts. They might be trying to warn you about something you can't yet see.